Hey everybody, Andrew back for another Barista Basics video. Now before I get into today's video, of course, I need to make my quick disclaimer that any opinions stated in my videos are my own. I am not here to represent Starbucks or any other corporation or impede on any of these companies' intellectual properties or trademarks. My videos are, of course, just meant for fun and educational purposes. So with that said, we can go ahead and get into today's topic, which is all about the different regions of the world where coffee is most commonly grown. So as you may recall, in last week's episode, I alluded to this topic because we were speaking about the three main subspecies of the coffee plant, which is arabica, robusta, and liberica. And actually, okay, a little side note before we delve into today's topic. As we can see throughout this video, I have learned that arabica beans are pronounced arabica as opposed to however I pronounced it last episode. I can't even remember at this point. Needless to say, it is not the correct way to pronounce it. I would like to thank my manager from Starbucks, Christine, for informing me of how to properly pronounce arabica in the midst of a conversation we were having. However, I do wish that we had this conversation maybe a few days before I filmed that video, because I do feel a little embarrassed for the fact that I so greatly mispronounced arabica. But anyways, we have grown since then. We have learned how to properly pronounce it, and we can just pretend that I was pronouncing it the right way in that video and not the embarrassing way that I actually was. I don't know why I felt the need to say that. I think I just feel a little guilty and embarrassed for not saying it properly in the last video. Anyways, I'm digressing. It's pronounced arabica. We're all on the same page. So, to get into what we actually care about, today's topic, I have another little cheat sheet here that lists some of the main countries in certain regions that produce coffee, as well as some general information around what is called the Bean Belt, which is where I will begin. So the Bean Belt is aptly named, of course, because this is the area of Earth where coffee is best grown. So this Bean Belt falls between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. And so essentially what these are longitudinal lines, so lines that go across the Earth from east to west. And they are located 23.5 degrees either above or below the equator. So the Tropic of Cancer is the imaginary line that's located above the equator, whereas the Tropic of Capricorn is located below the equator. So as you can imagine, this essentially creates a strip, I guess you could say, down the center of the Earth where coffee is best grown. And if we think about it a little bit, that makes sense, because coffee loves sunlight and warm climates, as well as places with typically high average annual rainfall. And as you can imagine, the area around the equator fits this to a T. So coffee loves the equator, and 23.5 degrees north and south of it apparently as well. So to get into the actual regions within the coffee belt, there are three, general regions. We have the Americas, including North, Central, and South America. We have Africa, and we have Asia. So I have listed next to these either regions or subregions some of the countries in these regions that are main producers of coffee. So for North America, we have Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii. For Central America, we have Guatemala and Costa Rica. For South America, we have Brazil and Colombia. We will address what those numbers mean when we get to that part of the video. Now, moving on to countries located in Africa, we have Ethiopia, which is also special in the world of coffee, which we will also get to. We have Kenya, as well as the Ivory Coast. Moving on to Asia, we have Vietnam. Again, we will discuss what that number 3 means, Indonesia, and Yemen. And so before I get into each one of these countries in particular and sort of explain their generally what kind of coffee comes from these countries, I do want to say that this is not a fully comprehensive list. There are numerous countries within these regions that I do not have listed here that also produce coffee. These are just some of the most common. So, like I said, this is not a fully comprehensive or inclusive list. So now I can go ahead and retire the cheat sheet because I have here a piece of paper that, like I said, details the general characteristics of the coffee that comes from each one of these countries. And as you could see, there were a bunch of countries on that list, so I have written down the corresponding information, and I'm going to read off this paper I have here to ensure the utmost accuracy. So first, we're going to explore the Americas, starting with North America, more specifically Mexico. So coffee that comes from Mexico is described as having sharp and complex flavors, as well as being very aromatic. And typically, this Mexican coffee is better suited for dark roasts. Moving on to Puerto Rico, this country's, well, it's not a country actually, it's a territory. This territory's coffee has been described as having a balance of both body and acidity and having a fruity aroma. In addition, Puerto Rico is known for mainly producing arabica coffee beans. And so all of this information entails that Puerto Rican coffee is typically best suited for medium roasts. Moving on to our final area of North America that I had listed, which is Hawaii. Now, Hawaii is best known for its Kona coffee. That's K-O-N-A, and I'm sure that this is a coffee you are probably familiar with or have at least seen before. And so Kona coffee is very rich and aromatic and is best suited for medium roasts. Moving on to Central America, our first country listed is Guatemala, which grows coffee that is described as being medium to full-bodied with complex, deep, and rich flavors that are slightly spiced and or chocolatey. And this all entails that Guatemalan coffee is usually best reserved for dark roasts. I guess I should also say before I continue, along with the fact that this is not fully comprehensive, these are also generalities, which is another disclaimer that I made in the previous video, which makes sense because, like I said in the last video, even the smallest difference as the farm in a certain region where the coffee is grown can greatly impact it. So again, these are all generalizations, and not every coffee that comes from these regions is going to necessarily be this way. And Jupiter has decided to pay a visit. Hello, Jupiter. So moving on to Costa Rica, our second country for Central America. Coffee that comes from Costa Rica has been described as having medium body and sharp acidity, and has been described as the sort of perfect balance of these two. This, of course, entails that it is best suited for a medium roast, and I also have written down here that Costa Rica only wet processes its coffee. So I guess actually this episode is tying in a little bit from multiple episodes, which is pretty cool. And I also have written here that Costa Rica is mostly known for producing arabica coffee. Moving on to South America, we have Brazil, which, relating back to the number one I have on the cheat sheet, is the number one producer of coffee in the world. And which is an amazing feat. Congratulations to Brazil. We love your coffee. Speaking on its coffee, though, it has described as being clear and sweet, as well as having a medium body with low acidity. And Brazil is known for producing both arabica and robusta coffee, which I guess would make sense when we think about how it is the number one producer of coffee in the world. So of course it would produce the two most popular types. And before moving on to Colombia, I do also need to say that Brazilian coffee is typically best suited for medium roasts. We'll just go ahead and let Jupiter chill out a little bit. So moving on to Colombia now. This is the number two producer of coffee in the world. So Colombian coffee has been described as being mild, soft, and having a well-balanced acidity. And Colombian coffee, based off these characteristics, is typically best suited for blonde roasts. Now, that exhausts the countries that I have listed in the Americas. Now we can move on to countries in Africa, starting with Ethiopia. Now, as I mentioned in the little preview, Jupiter is having fun. As I mentioned in the little preview when I first went over the cheat sheet, Ethiopia is another special country because this is considered by many to be the birthplace of arabica coffee, which is believed to be the first type of coffee. So Ethiopia is a pretty cool place for multiple reasons, but that's just one of them. So to describe coffee that comes from Ethiopia, generally this coffee is bold and fully flavored and fully bodied, which of course means that it would be best suited for a dark roast. Now moving on to Kenya. Coffee that comes from Kenya has been described as being sharp, fruity, and acidic, with a rich aroma and full body. And this implies that Kenyan coffee is typically best suited for either medium or dark roasts. Moving on to our final country in Africa that I had listed on the cheat sheet, the Ivory Coast. Coffee that comes from this country has been described as having very strong aromatics, but also having a light body and a low acidity, which entails that it is best suited either for dark roasts or espresso roasts, essentially due to the strong aromatics and the low acidity. The lightly bodied doesn't necessarily align with a dark roast or an espresso roast, but the information that I found, hey baby, stated that coffee from this region would best be suited for either dark or espresso roasts. And I do also have written down here, so this actually makes sense because the Ivory Coast is one of the largest producers of the Robusta coffee, which, as I mentioned in the last episode, is primarily used for darker roasts like espresso roasts. So I guess it would make sense why the information I found would say that coffee from Ivory Coast is best suited for darker espresso. So that's pretty cool. However, we are going to move on to our final region, which is Asia. And our first country listed is Vietnam, and this is the third largest producer of coffee in the world. And so Vietnamese coffee has been described as having a light acidity and is also light-bodied, as well as having generally a good balance of body, acidity, as well as flavors. And it is frequently used actually for different coffee blends. So not typically a coffee that will stand on its own. With that said though, it is best suited for medium blends. Moving on to Indonesia. Indonesian coffee has been described as being rich, full-bodied, and having a low acidity. In Indonesia, I also have written down here that most of their coffee is dry processed, and that Indonesian coffee is typically best suited for dark roasts. Moving on to our final country of this very brief list, we have Yemen, which is actually the first place where coffee was commercially cultivated. So that's another interesting little tidbit. Hello. Alright, that was fun. Regarding what the actual coffee from Yemen tastes like, it is described as being very distinctive and having a unique flavor that is very deep and rich. Similarly to Indonesia, coffee from Yemen is also primarily dry processed, and coffee that comes from Yemen is typically best suited for medium or dark roasts. So that is actually going to be all for today's video. I can go ahead and show our cheat sheet once again. So to do a quick review, coffee grows in an area that has been aptly named Bean Belt, and this is because it is essentially the section of Earth that gets the most average sunlight, is the warmest, as well as gets the most average annual rainfall, that is. So the three regions that fall in this bean belt are the Americas, which of course encompass North, Central, and South America, Africa, and Asia. And again, before I conclude this video, I do want to reiterate that this is not a fully comprehensive list. There are numerous other countries within these regions that also produce coffee, and each country's coffee will of course have a unique characteristic about it. So with all of that said, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I hope that you guys learned something. Even more importantly, I hope you at least learned how to pronounce arabica. Yeah, so I hope that you guys learned something, of course, and I hope that you guys are having a great day, a great start to 2020. I hope that you had a great February. February is almost over. Crazy to believe that we are almost in March. 2020 is just flying by. And I also can't believe that this video was almost 20 minutes long. This is definitely the longest video that I have ever made before, and so I hope that you guys have stuck around to the end, to be honest. If you have, thank you sincerely. Even if not, you're not going to receive this message, but I hope that you still enjoyed the video, and I hope that you, as well as everybody else, again, are having a great day, and I hope to see you guys in next week's episode. Thank you guys so much.